I did not plan these next 2 days here in Phoenix to unfold the way they're going to for me, but I found it almost providential the way they in fact are, which is that everything I'm going to be saying here at the Great Hearts, the Classical Learning Symposium, and then tonight when I go to lecture at Arizona State University, everything comes from this book that I've had in preparation for a number of years called Poetic Theory, Ancient Beauty, Modern Verse. And so today this is actually going to eventually be the first chapter and the sort of foundation of the book, and then tonight I'm going to be lecturing on poetic traditions, and then at Arizona State, and then here tomorrow I'm going to be giving 2 workshops, which what they do just suddenly clarified itself for me while I was drinking bourbon with David Rothman last night, which was that one is effectively a Whig history of poetry, and the other one is the antithesis. In fact, it has a quotation from Eliot: "Art never improves." And I think they're both right, because the Whig history of poetry is that the Whig history of verse is that from Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse through to Shakespeare and then Milton's late iambic pentameter, we really do see a development of the technique and the technology of verse. So there is a kind of evolution to it. But, so that will be the subject of one workshop, and it's for the purposes of pedagogy. How do you teach kids to hear and to write prosody? Well, one way to do it is to have them learn it in the same order that the human race learned it. Okay? But then the other workshop, Art Never Improves, it starts with Eliot's premise that art never improves, but is never quite the same. Meaning that when we see transformations in an art form, it's not necessarily because the verse is improving, it's because it's trying to figure out how to express something that it hasn't tried to express before. And so, which means that the past doesn't go away, the past becomes permanently one of the available ways in which we can say what needs to be said. So those are all going to be late chapters in the book. This, as I said, is the first one, and it's really the grounding for my whole ambition in that book and in my broader interest in poetry, which is the way in which poetry enters into and elevates philosophy and theology, and the way in which philosophy and theology enter into and elevate, transform poetry. What do they all have in common? So I'm going to be talking about poetry today, but I'm not going to make a single reference to a poet in my comments to you. So this is philosophy helping us to think about, this will be philosophy helping us to think about poetry. And so where else would we begin talking about philosophy but with Plato? Everyone knows the variety of references to poetry in Plato's dialogues, but if you had to choose one dialogue where poetry seems to be at the center, well, let me just get a show of hands. Anybody want to volunteer? What's the one dialogue where poetry seems to be most a matter of contention? Yes? The Republic, right? Because we get, in, book 10, we get the Socrates finally fessing up that there's an ancient quarrel of which nobody was previously aware between poetry and philosophy, and and so indeed, and you hear bad readings of the Republic where Plato kicked the poets out of the city, etc., which is, nobody who's actually read the dialogue really would say that, but Karl Popper, other bad readers would say things like that. What in all of Plato, poetry is always, really synonymous with music. Or maybe I think the better way to put it is that poiesis, poetry, has 2 essential dimensions for Plato that can't be separated except rationally. You can think about them separately, but they're really one. And that is melody and rhythm, the musica aspect of it, but then storytelling, the mythos aspect of it. Those are held together in the Republic, but if you attend to what Plato says about poetry in the Republic, he's primarily thinking of poetry in terms of storytelling. Poetry is the way in which the unformed, receive images of actions And those images are formative of the soul, such that receiving bad images might malform the soul, receiving good images might form the soul well. The reason that poets might, at least, the reason Socrates flirts with exiling the poets is precisely because they might give bad images to the young. But poetry, in its image bequeathing, in its mythos dimension in the Republic, is related to, though not expressly conjoined with, the liberal arts and mathematics. And so, insofar as it can be grouped in with mathematics and the other liberal arts, it does play a particular role in the movement or the growth of the soul as the Republic describes it, which is the growth from the movement from appearances by way of what we might call abstraction, especially in mathematics, on across the divided line to being itself. And so the two most conspicuous features of poetry in the Republic is the storytelling mythos function and the way in which it relates to this movement of the soul from the world out of the cave and into the light of the good. So it's an ascent. It's a poetic ascent. Everything's an ascent in the Republic. Laws, which of course is much later dialogue, but the only one that rivals the Republic in terms of the number of pages, tells us a slightly different story. Yes, poetry is both mythos and musica. It's both storytelling and melody and rhythm, which is a phrase actually from the symposium that I'll advert to in a little while. But the description of it is in Laws couldn't be more different from what we get in the Republic. In the Laws, young people are thought of as jumping about randomly. I mean, it's cartoonish how Socrates describes them. These sort of weird, ungoverned movements, I suppose just like a baby in its cradle with its limbs flailing, right? That's what you are, and then when you're a toddler, you skip about. And Socrates then says, but music descends from above, from the muses, and enters into the city, into the world, and into the body of the young. And their random flailings, hopping and skipping about movements are brought to order and measure. Order, measure, and weight, if you want to quote the Book of Wisdom. And so two things are conspicuous about the treatment of the Laws. The first one is that musica, rather than mythos, is primary. Poetry is not about the substantial images that it presents before the eye of the soul. Poetry is rather chiefly defined by its formal property, its meter, and the way in which the meter enters into the soul, not by a substantial image you've seen by the soul, but rather as a measurement perceived by the soul and formative of the soul. The other aspect that's conspicuous about Plato's discussion of poetry in the Laws is precisely that far from poetry being associated with appearances and then possibly being allowed to persist in the city as the soul ascends beyond appearances to truth. Far, in other words, from being a story of ascent, the musica of poetry is an act of descent, of the cosmic order of things, entering into the city and the soul and forming it. And this, I think, is perhaps, well, with the exception of the Phaedrus, which I will be sharing with you later, is probably Plato's most profound claim about the nature of the poetic. That in hearing the rhythms of meter, the rhythms of music, you're receiving the orderliness of being from above and having it enter into and incarnate itself in the ordering of your very self. In both cases, there is a danger of corruption. The Republic is the best known one, of course. Bad images, blasphemous images of the gods, may encourage vicious behavior in the young. But in the laws, I guess the people who think of Plato as the first totalitarian do have some basis, because the laws, Tipper Gore and Plato have this much in common. In the laws, he says you have to be very careful not to allow new music into the city, because the different rhythms might reshape the soul in a way that deforms it. He doesn't say you have to be careful not to. He says you should just be very cautious before allowing new music into the city. What we're hearing in both of these dialogues is Plato's conception that poetry is formative of the soul, and that the way in which it forms us is by habit, by habituation. So I want to share, and let's see, what do we have till 10:45? But I don't want to talk that long. It's 9:45 now. So let's see how much we can get through this. Here are the thoughts I want to share with you. First, I want to talk about why, for Plato, poetry should have the central role in these two most important of his dialogues, not to mention several others that I'll mention today. Why, in other words, is poetry the paradigmatic art form? I then want to explain why, sort of Poetic, the Republic, but in line with the laws, why meter is so central to poetry, is essential to poetry, but is not the essence of poetry. One of my favorite poets and critics was the mid-century, originally Stanford-trained poet J.V. Cunningham. And in Cunningham's wonderful introduction to his collected essays, he says, when I talk about poetry, I'm talking about what someone means by poetry when he goes to the bookstore to buy a graduation present and buys a book of poetry for the graduate. Which means nobody's going to go there and say, oh, look at this Joy Graham poem. It's all fragmented. This will really, this will be greeted with a smile when it's unwrapped on graduation day. No. You buy Palgrave's Treasury or something with gold and gilt, and everything in there needs to be in meter. Right? Cunningham says poetry is verse. It's metrical composition meter. And it says everything else is super addition to it. It's part of the tradition or conventions, but it's not of the essence of poetry. I want to argue today, in fact, that that's not quite right. Meter is of the essence of poetry, but there's such a thing as unmetered poetry, and that's because poetry's essence is, depending on how you want to measure it, either trifold or tetrafold. And happily for me, all the folds start with M's. So we'll be talking about making, memory, metaphor, and meter. And this will explain why meter is central to poetry, but why poetry does more than just meter. And then we'll conclude with just two further thoughts. The role that meter plays in this act of habituation, and also with an argument as to why you should care that poetry is involved in habituation. What do you all, as educators of the young, have to gain by reflecting on this idea of poetry as playing a role in the habituation, the formation of young people? Okay, musica and mythos. Plato gives us at least two aspects or dimensions of the essence of poetry, and this should lead us to make one preliminary observation right away. And that is that poetry is not exclusively about its content. It's not simply the thing seen, the story told, the image given. It's that, It has mythos. It has a dimension that's material or substantive, or content, excuse me. But it also has this other dimension of being a form. Not a thing seen, but a way of seeing. Not a thing represented, but a way of representing. And here I think Plato's taking us a good step into the mystery of poetry. Because it's possible from the Republic to think that what poetry does is just gives us stories, and in our day of hyper-abstraction, we can say, well, why can't I just translate that story into any medium I want, and it makes no difference, any form I want. And the answer is no, you can't, and still have it be poetry, because poetry has both its thing seen, its image dimension, or its mythos dimension, but it has also its formal dimension, and this, as I said, in the laws, is what actually predominates, though neither is inessential. Poetry, in other words, is, for the reader, both a thing seen and a way of seeing. A substance perceived, but also a mode of perception or a way of knowing. Okay, so let's dive in, shall we? The first place to begin is with this idea of making. And in fact, in poetry's making dimension, we get its first justification for why it might be considered the paradigmatic art form. I want to share with you a quotation, not from the Republic or from the laws, but from late in Plato's Symposium. In fact, I think this is probably the only thing I'm going to read to you today, aside from maybe a few lines from Hesiod. So here are the words of Diotima late in Symposium. And those of you who don't know the dialogue, those of you who do know it will agree with me, the dialogue's about love, right, and the nature of beauty. It's not primarily about poetry, although poetry certainly sneaks its way in different places in that dialogue. Many places. Like water through cracks in the wall of my basement. No, I'm joking. But poetry is not the explicit subject. And so when Socrates speaks with the priestess Diotima and learns of the great mysteries of love, and the ladder of love ascending to the eternal, engendering beauty, before she can even take him on that ladder of analogies, of different analogical form of loves, she has to explain the principle of analogy to him. And how does she do it but with the word poiesis, poetry? And so here it is. This is what Diotima says to Socrates. Well, you know, for example, that poetry, poiesis, has a very wide range of meanings. After all, everything that is responsible for creating something out of nothing is a kind of poetry. And so all the creations of every craft and perception are themselves a kind of poetry, and everyone who practices a craft is a poet. Nevertheless, as you also know, these craftsmen are not called poets. They're called things like carpenters, house builders, welders, right? We have other words for them, and out of the whole of poetry, we have marked off just one part, the part the muses give us with melody and rhythm, and we refer to this by the word that means the whole. For this alone is called poetry, and those who practice this part of poetry or making alone are called poets. So you see what she's proposing here. Every act of making is poiesis, but only the kind of making, a particular kind of making, actually can claim the name of poet. Everything else is poetics, as it were, by analogy. Why did verse writing get to claim to be the paradigmatic art form, the paradigmatic form of making? I mean, imagine the world we would live in if carpentry were. And so poets would say, well, I'm sort of a carpenter with words. Right? If you know Seamus Heaney's poem Digging, that's the insecurities. He thinks that there are other kinds of making, such as the cutting of turf in the bog, that are more authentic than poetry. And so he has to justify poetry in terms of the other kinds of making that his father and grandfather did on the farm. Well, so that's not the world we live in. We live in the world where poetry, despite the fact that nobody shows up for poetry readings, poetry is the prestige, the paradigmatic art form. It's the paradigmatic kind of making. Why? Why should it be? I think the crucial thing is in that last phrase, and I'm going to parse this phrase twice today, the part the muses give us with melody and rhythm. Just the half of that phrase, the part the muses give us. as Plato will say in the Phaedrus, and clarify in the Phaedrus, as mushy a category as it sounds, poetry has something to do with inspiration, the infusion of the muses, of the Holy Spirit, or in the case of Philip Sidney, the beauty of a beloved woman. Something in the act of making is dependent on a gift from outside of the poet. In the Phaedrus, this gets clarified, most obviously, because in the Phaedrus, the subject of the whole discussion is the nature of love as a kind of madness or infused gift from the gods, divine madness. But in brief, in poetry, we see that all the talent and technique in the world, as important and essential as it is, nonetheless isn't sufficient to make the poem a good, unified whole. It must receive something greater than the sum of its technical parts in order to be one. And even the muse agnostic must acknowledge this. There's more to the poem than all the technique and preparation in the world. And I don't feel I need to be agnostic. I think talking about the muses is a good thing, not a hokey thing. Talking about the influence of the Holy Spirit is also a very good idea. But what's so perceptive in Diotima's paragraph there is that she's emphasizing that it's in poetry that we see with a clarity that's not as obvious in other modes of making, that it's part craft but also partly gift. That it's part from below, but also partly from above. If Fred Turner's here, I think not the last time Fred and I were in a room together, but one of the last times we were in a room together, we were listening to a talk by a fellow who was translating the Iliad, for some reason into tetrameter blank verse. I'll never get that, but nonetheless, he was translating the Iliad, and he gave a wonderful lecture on that Homer is the first poet in the classical tradition who emphasizes that the poet is both maker and receiver, both active and passive, producer, but also impregnated. Okay. So this is just very fundamental, I think, to all perceptions of poetry, but most explicitly, clearly, in the classical world, that both in Homer and in Plato we sense that what makes poetry paradigmatic is precisely because there we see with a clarity we might not otherwise the way in which gift from above and technique from below are united as one. I probably don't need to belabor this point, but I will just for 1 second. I guess we would say for the carpenter, that's a good box, but it didn't take the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to make that box, right? So we can envision a carpenter's technique being adequate to the making of a good house. But in poetry, we doubt that. We sense that there's something greater that has to be from above. Yeah, Andrew.
Are you distinguishing the carpenter from the let's say carver, the designer who makes beautiful woodwork?
Well, so I don't want to push that distinction because my argument is that with Diotima is that poiesis is all analogical, and so all kinds of making in fact entail this kind of synthesis of the divine and the human, but that in poetry we see it most explicitly. That's why it gets the name. If it was as obvious in carpentry as it is in poetry, then we would call poetry carpentry, or a species of carpentry rather than vice versa. Does that make sense? That's my argument. I don't want to make any hard distinctions. I think one of the great benefits of, amongst other things, Jacques Maritain's art and scholasticism was that it broke down the distinction that had accumulated in the 18th and 19th century, at least since Kant, between the artisan and the artist. We need to recover and maintain that because poetry is a kind of making. It is a kind of craft primarily, but it's a craft where we see its inspiration present most explicitly. So that's why it's the paradigmatic form of making. Memory. This is going to sound so obvious that that if you haven't thought of it before, you'll slap yourself on the side of the head for not having thought of it. Of course, memory is part of the essence of poetry. Because who is the mother of the muses? Mnemosyne, memory itself. This comes to us not primarily from Homer, although I think the opening lines of the Iliad suggest to us how it works, but it comes to us primarily from Hesiod, the other, foundational epic poet of the ancient world. Mnemosyne is the mother of the muses. Why is that? Well, we have only to look at the fleetingness of human existence to know just why it is. We can't even be present to the present without a memory that conjoins the present with past and future. We'll be coming back to that. But for our purposes for the moment, let me just meditate on it this way. Events occur, and no sooner have they occurred than they're carried away into oblivion. It is only memory, so time scatters. It is only memory that takes what has been scattered by time and gathers it and allows it to be present as a non-temporal whole. And from that whole, and from that whole alone, can come forth then, amongst other things, the telling of stories. Time scatters, memory gathers, and the muses bequeath. In Paul Claudel's 5 Great Odes, he mentions how that Mnemosyne can't speak. And I'm not totally clear on what Claudel intends there, but when I first read that line, that made sense to me. Of course memory can't speak. She requires the muses to speak for her, but she is the great storehouse, the mansion from which everything they have to say comes. Those of us who make memory the primary of the various M's of poetry, those of us who make memory primary are more likely to follow in Aristotle's train. As you know, in the Poetics, Aristotle says that you can analyze poetry by its meter, but that actually doesn't take you very far. He doesn't say, contrary to what Renaissance readers of him thought, that verse has nothing to do with the essence of poetry. He just says that it doesn't take you very far in the understanding of it. Right? If you said, what's the Oedipus Rex about? And I said, it's about hexameter, you would not go away happy. You would not be satisfied. So, but I mentioned metaphor as one of the other M's. We'll be talking about that in a few moments. Metaphor does something else that actually Aristotle's not very attentive to. In the Poetics, what Aristotle's attentive to is memory, by which I mean the following. More M's coming at you. Memory is what enables you to tell stories. So memory allows for the making of plots. And for Aristotle, the making of plots is primarily what poetry is, which is why people have, been so irresponsibly cavalier about saying that poetry for Aristotle is just any kind of storytelling. Well, no, but it's mostly about that for him. And then, of course, the making of plots involves things that take place in time. Because plot is the unfolding of the form of time that memory alone can perceive. If that's the case, then that means that poetry is primarily going to be about human action. Because it's human actions that unfold in time. The gods don't unfold in time. Homer depicts them as unfolding in time for our sake, but we're understanding in that case the gods in terms of the human. We're not seeing the gods in their own nature, at least as Aristotle would have it in his theology. So that means that memory is primarily conceived of in the ancient world in terms of the capacity to tell stories. And that explains why 5 of the muses are given to different kinds of making of poetry, but then we also have the muse of history, and why in the ancient world, storytelling really is the foundation of the arts. Actually, it was Andrew Ellison who gave me a book. I'm forgetting his name now, but you'll know it's The Disinherited Mind.
Heller.
Yes, Heller. Yeah. So Heller speaks in that book, This is Inherited Mind, about the decadence of the arts once music became the paradigmatic art form. And I think that, leaving decadence aside, actually, that he's certainly right that a transformation occurred. That in the ancient world, memory was so foundational to the arts that narrative storytelling was so foundational that an art form was higher the more it was capable of telling a story. So epic is the highest form, lyric is down low, because lyrics don't usually tell stories, or if they do, they're short, boring, and plangent, right? So that's, whereas in the disinherited mind, just the opposite obtains. Lyric becomes the highest form of poetry because it's the one that's most susceptible to song. Okay. Another transformation occurs that actually may explain that one. And I won't go into this very long, but I just want to at least make a nod towards it. Those of you who know your St. Augustine know that memory itself is going to be transformed in our understanding of it. That memory, understanding, and will are the interior faculties of the human soul that make it to bear the image of God. And from the moment Augustine wrote that, he set us on the path to making the lyric poem actually a much more distinguished poem, because the lyric becomes then the exploration of memory, the exploration of the interior of the self and the soul. As Frederick Turner has said in an important essay, but of course one has to have something in the soul for that to make an interesting lyric poem. And alas, for too many poets, there's not a lot there. So memory isn't restricted to storytelling, but memory as the essence of poetry begins primarily as the warehouse of stories, and then it develops to become the warehouse of the self, as in other modes of poetry. All right. I do want to refer to Hesiod. I won't read from the Theogony, but in the Theogony, Hesiod gives us a good account of poets as the memory of the race. He says that the Muses, the daughters of memory, tell us what is to be, and what is before now. Yep. So they tell us of the past, present, and the future. This part sounds familiar because it's mostly plot telling. It's talking about time, what has happened, what is now, and what is to come. But he also tells us in a remarkable passage that the poets tell us about things like the actions of giants and men. I remember my wife saying when I first read this to her, "Why giants?" Well, of course, for the same reason that philosopher tells us that we have to believe in fairies, that the world is full, and there's got to be something between us and the gods. For most of us, it's angels, but for Hesiod, it's giants. Why does that matter? Because what he's telling us is not only do poets tell you about the passage of time, but they tell you about the shape of space, the cosmic order in its hierarchy, from Zeus as father of the gods, the other gods, down to giants, and then to the actions of men. And of course, a later poet, Virgil, would take us down below the actions of the men to the actions of the earth in the Georgics. So you really have both space and time. Everything there is to know is to be contained in memory and to be expressed in the poet, according to Hesiod. So there's memory for you. Now, what about metaphor? I think if there's one moment in Plato that I could just talk about over and over again for the rest of my life, and in fact I've been doing it for 12 years, so I'll just keep going, but is Plato's Phaedrus, and specifically the palinode in the Phaedrus. I don't know how well you remember this, but it's such an extraordinary moment. Phaedrus has just given a bad speech, or recited a bad speech about the nature of love. Socrates recites one that's actually pretty much on the same moral theme as Phaedrus is, which is give your sexual favors to those who don't love you, because if they love you, they'll try to possess you and they might even kill you. Right? Each man kills the things he loves, as Oscar Wilde put it many, many years later. Well, Socrates, being well-formed, feels immediately bad about this. And so he recites a palinode, that is to say, a poem of repentance. And the palinode begins by saying there are 4 kinds of divine madness or divine inspiration. And he lists them off. I think in order, first it's the poet, who for all that technique he might have, he's nonetheless dependent on the gift of the muses to make a good poem. So first the poet. Second is the performer of rites for the gods, by which he means if somebody has committed a murder, his conscience suddenly impels him to run to the shrine of whatever deity of the city is and perform some kind of sacrifice and rites in order to be shriven. The third is the prophet, the one who says what could not otherwise be said except through inspiration. And the fourth is the lover, who's moved by the anamnesis of the beauty, that's stirred by the beauty of the beloved, to recover his true self. And that of course becomes the central burden of the palinode, is to describe what happens when you see beauty here and what your soul does and how it ascends. This is why Plato was so amazing. I just gave you 4 different kinds of divine madness. What does Socrates do in the palinode? He becomes the poet who, in an act of reparation to the gods, speaks prophetically about the nature of love. It just doesn't get any better than that. It's so perfect. What happens in the poem? Well, as many of you will know, at one point, Plato, always fond of hierarchies, lists out the various types of human souls, and he does not hesitate to mention that poets are literally 6th-rate human beings, right? They're just above used car salesmen. But he's reciting a poem. His poem's insulting poets? How can this be? Well, the crucial thing is this. He says elsewhere in the palinode, all poets in the past have been too earthly. They just do what Aristotle says they do. They recite about human actions and good and evil. That's ethics. Ethics is important. As Aristotle says, it's philosophical, but it's not the highest form of philosophy. The highest form of philosophy for Plato and for Aristotle alike is metaphysics, or natural theology, the ascent to being, or beyond being, if you want to be Platonic about it, which many people do. And so, there's a hackneyed argument that Plato kicked the poets out of the city, but Aristotle defended them and wrote the Poetics. Well, yeah, Aristotle defends poets, but Aristotle's defense of poetry is actually pretty tepid. They're pretty good at conveying plots. Not unimportant, but not the highest philosophy. Forgive the crudity of my speech here, but Socrates says, here, hold my beer. It would take a god and a long time, Phaedrus, to tell you the nature of the soul. And so I won't even try to tell you the nature of the soul that way. I will rather tell you. The soul is like a chariot, piloted by a charioteer, with one light horse who's good and obedient, and the other who's dark and refractory. Oh, and it circles the heavens. And at the limit of the cosmos, at the limit of the heavens, it looks up and it nourishes itself upon the invisible beauty of the ideas. And as it descends to the earth, like a giant whirlpool or vortex, it becomes attached to material things and causes them to move. What is this? What looks like a tornado for Socrates? You turn it on its side and you realize it's the planets. It's the shape of the cosmos itself. So what has Socrates just done? In the course of a few pages, he has outlined the invisible nature of the soul and has described or mapped out the entire cosmos, both the place of matter from the highest heavens down to the basest of earth and its circulations, but also what's beyond the cosmos, the uncreated, eternal, ever stable and unmoving forms of ideas. It would be hard to describe the soul, but it would be impossible to express in words the ideas or truths, the splendorous forms that are above. It would be impossible to express fully in words. And so at every step of the palindrome, Socrates speaks in terms of metaphor. And I mean this broadly conceived, metaphor as in any use of figurative language. Aristotle said poets could represent actions and tell stories, and therefore enter into the philosophy of good and evil or ethics. Socrates says, no. That's okay, but that's pretty much a sixth-rate activity. The highest possible activity is that through the gift of metaphor, to make manifest in words that which could otherwise never be disclosed in this world, in this vale of tears. Poets are sixth-rate human beings because they've never lived up to their calling. The true calling of the poet is to be at once poet, philosopher, poet, and prophet. So often, and in the, I'm actually this is going to be included in this book I'm telling you I'm writing. Sometime in the 17th century, probably beginning with Hobbes, but I'm not certain about this, metaphor and figurative speech comes to be thought of almost exclusively as the ornamentation of rhetoric. It certainly belongs to rhetoric, but ornamentation is the key word. What Plato is telling us here is that what's distinctive about metaphor is not the way it gilds the lily, but rather the way it reveals what otherwise could not be known. Making, memory, metaphor, but finally meter. The part the muses give us with melody and rhythm. That's what Diotima says. So now we turn to the second half of that phrase. They give us melody and rhythm. Meter, as the laws suggest, is perhaps the most fundamental of the three or four M's of poetry. Precisely because it is the formative principle that allows what's stored in memory to find expression in intelligible reality, that is to say, in language. But also this. Music, as the laws tells us, is a measured out linguistic and rhythmic property of the made thing, the poem, that is expressive of what will eventually be called the musica mundana, the music of the world, the music of the spheres. And so the poet is not inventing rhythms. The poet is conforming the movements of language to the pre-existent eternal rhythms of the cosmos. What that means is that meter, I say it's most fundamental, even though I have a very Trinitarian conception of these three M's. There's a circumcision that's like Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's very Nicene. But meter does attain a certain kind of primacy because meter, in one sense, contains memory and metaphor. It contains it literally, as in it's the form of the story you have to tell. But also in another way, meter itself is measuring time. Therefore, it's kind of the first story. It's time's plot. Tick, 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 da, 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 da. It's bringing order to time itself, which is sort of the very minimum of plotting. So somehow meter comprehends plot. But also, if meter is somehow a manifestation here and now in the microcosm of the general patterned intelligibility of the cosmos, of the macrocosm, then meter is also the first metaphor. The reason it does what it does as meter is is because of its metaphorical capacity to bring present, manifest to us here what transcends us, in order that transcends us. This was brought home to me most clearly, not either by Plato or Aristotle, but by, one of my rivals. Thomas Aquinas has to be everybody's favorite saint, but the next one can be his sort of troubled stepbrother, St. Augustine. St. Augustine, we could be here all day for me to just give you the references to meter in Augustine's writing, to meter and mathematics, which are, as for Plato, they're all but one for him. But I'll give you, I think, two examples will suffice. In the early dialogue on the freedom of the will, Augustine's, I forget who his interlocutor is there, it's been too long since I read it, but Augustine's trying to convince his interlocutor that God exists. And he says, when you know 2 + 2 = 4, is that true? He says, yes. His interlocutor says, well, is that truth in you, or does it transcend you because it's true for everybody? Well, it's true for everybody, says the man. Well, then you know that God exists, because if truth doesn't exist here, but it exists in something that transcends any particular creature, then truth can only subsist in the divine mind that causes things to be. Augustine's done. This is early anticipation of the ontological argument in Anselm. As everybody knows, well, as many people know, Augustine anticipated almost all the arguments of the modern age, including Descartes' cogito ergo sum, the difference being that Augustine didn't make a big stink about having come up with the cogito ergo sum. He just said, well, so we know skepticism's not right. He just moves on with his life. Descartes has to think he's the genius of the New World. So then Augustine says, let's stick with mathematics in particular. The examples people give during lectures are always terrible. It's like, look at this dry erase marker. Come on, pretend there's a giraffe here, okay? Look at this giraffe. Is the giraffe one? Yes, you say. Is its oneness a material property? Oh, good question. Because when I look at the giraffe and the material of the giraffe, I can actually infinitely divide it. Right? I can first divide it into its limbs, into its flesh and bone, but then from there I can go down to the various molecules, and from the molecules to the atoms, from the atoms to whatever's beneath atoms. I didn't study physics at school, but Fred will tell us. And then from there I can keep going. There is no limit, mathematically speaking, though there may be materially speaking, to how far I can divide the giraffe. So its oneness cannot inhere in its material being. The oneness of the giraffe must be given to you, says Augustine, by the mind of God, by divine illumination. Now, I think there's much more to be said for Augustine's illumination theory than is often given for it, but I'm going to leave all that aside. I just want to take one nugget from this that's essential for poetry. What he's telling us, in other words, is that in our everyday life, when we see things as one, we sense that eternity is marking time with number. Time itself isn't sufficient unto itself to enumerate itself. Every encounter with a number here is also an apprehension of what's beyond, of the eternal. So, to mark syllables with meter, to number them, is to make syllables is to mark the temporal syllables unfolding on the lips and passing away, to mark them with the eternal. So this is a beautiful condescension of the eternal into the present, but there's more. In his later writings, when Augustine's trying to understand the nature of time and the nature of eternity, the only way he can make sense of it is to turn to poetic meter itself as the exemplum, as the exemplary form that says, an eternal, stable mind can unfold or reveal itself historically or temporally. The example he gives is, he looks back to the different morality that seemed to obtain at different stages of the Old Testament. He said, this used to really perplex me. Why does God's justice seem to be saying this today and that the next day and that the next, or, in the next period? Is God's justice, which is eternal, changing? No, he says. The art of poetry is one and stable in me. But when I write a poem, I put a dactyl here, an I am there, a trochee here. I don't always put the same metrical foot at every moment. But so the expression of the art of poetry changes, but the art itself is one and whole and stays the same. He first worked on this argument in another early dialogue, True Religion, which is very early, where he says that, yes, the poem is out in the distended evanescence of time, but the art of poetry is always one whole and stable in the mind of the poet. And so then in the Confessions and later, he begins to see that this helps him gain some purchase on how God can be eternal and stable and everlasting, even as what he governs as one, stable and everlasting, unfolds in different ways in historical time. So, poetic meter at once enables us to rise up and perceive God, but also to descend from God back into the world to understand history. Meter does this for Augustine. What I think, I don't think I'm saying anything unobvious here. From the tenor of my comments, you can see that Plato, in the Laws, seems to be getting closer to the essence of poetry than he does in the Republic, because poetry as musica, as form and rhythm, is not to the prejudice against mythos, but is in some sense more fundamental than mythos. This is important to recognize because I think it explains something about how education works. I'm going to brief aside. There's this passage from Terry Eagleton, the Marxist critic, in his Introduction to Literary Theory, where I forget how it goes exactly, but he says all the literary humanists of the world, when they went into Auschwitz and saw that the Nazi camp guards had been reading Goethe, they suddenly had some explaining to do about the moral salutary qualities of humane letters. Like what if they're reading this? Why aren't they good people? Like us who read Hemingway. Why indeed? So the sense of the classic Horatian idea of poetry as a mixture of instruction with pleasure, I think first of all, it's too dependent on the substantive or material or mythos aspect of poetry and of literature. And in doing so, it actually misses almost entirely what I think is the real formative nature of poetry, which will be located in melody and rhythm. And just these last few moments, I want to make that argument. In Aristotle, in the Ethics, habituation has a relatively narrow compass. The human self is divisible into the mind, the body, and then that part of the self that mind and body together are involved in. The intellectual virtues, which are imparted to us through learning, of course, affect the mind and the mind alone. Only the part of education that involves mind and body together, only that is involved in the moral virtues, and that is to be imparted to us not by teaching, but by habituation, the breeding of habits. And the part that's exclusively the body, like flatulence, there's just no teaching that, right? So that's outside of his realm. So Aristotle says habituation plays a role in ethics, in character formation, but it exclusively pertains to the part of the self that involves mind and body together, which is the moral virtues. Everything else is to be imparted by learning. Curiously, all of the virtues of the intellect, because of the transcendent stability of the soul, since it's not of itself subject to matter, or the transcendent stability of the mind, all of the virtues of the intellect actualize faculties that are already in you. So if you have the virtue of reason, it's just your reason, your faculty of reason, fully actualized. Faculty of understanding in yourself is realized when you have the virtue of understanding, and so on and so forth. Moral virtues, not so. Morally, we're deeply underdetermined at birth. And so habituation bequeaths to us a second nature where we become good. Plato really ruffles with this model, obviously before Aristotle even conceived of it. For Plato, the soul is much more underdetermined, is much more fundamentally unstable, which is why you need music, why you need poetry. Poetry does two things. Familiarly in the Republic, it implants like seeds images of good actions, of virtues in you, appearances of virtues, so that as you mature and come into the faculties of your reason, you're already drawn to what is good. And so then when you mature, you simply know or understand why the apparent good really is good. Insofar as he says that's in keeping exactly with what Aristotle tells us. Right? Habits implant the soul with good images, and then you're trained to perform those images, and eventually you want to do them for their own sake because they are beautiful. But Plato departs from Aristotle on the nature of the intellect. He says that even the ordination of the mind to truth and reality is severely underdetermined, is unstable. It's like soil in the young person. And so seeds have to be implanted in the soul to orient it not only to what is good, but to what is true. It's easy to tell stories and show people give people the appearances of what's good. But how do you preform? How do you primordially orient the soul to being? The only way is through the formal properties of poetic meter. And so, yes, as the Republic says, poetry has something to do with ethics. It might orient us to what is good. But more fundamental, more primordial, to repeat the word, is this unthematized ontology of poetic rhythm that enters into the soul and first gives it an appearance of order that then will orient the mind to come into the knowledge of order through the study of mathematics and the other liberal arts of logic, where you see the relationships and understand the relationships that prosody has already planted in your soul. I think this is important for us as educators because on the one hand, we've got to realize that encounters with the real are not morally determinate. Nietzsche encountered the real. He looked into being, and the result for him did not necessarily make him someone you want to have your daughter marry. The Nazi guards reading Goethe looked into the real through poetry, but that didn't necessarily make them good. But that's because the act of formation of poetry is much subtler, much more fundamental than just good and bad behavior. It's the habituation of the mind to be perceptive of actuality. And actuality is dangerous. So you can't guarantee good results, but you can guarantee you're going to fail to have good results if you don't orient the soul at this most fundamental level to be perceptive of truth, even in super addition to the ethical and moral instructions that come through implanting young souls with the good. So thank you for your time and patience.